Later on, the man of such wicked indulgences now as Radio 4, historian Amanda Foreman explores the history and the legacy of the once mighty world of the Victorian Temperance Movement in The Demon Drink.
I wish all the liquor was bottled up well and cast to the bottomless dungeons of hell. It ruins our young men and makes all them slaves. Our fathers fall by it and fill drunkards' graves. Great Spirit that guided...
Of all the great popular campaigns in British history, from the Peasants' Revolt to the battle against the poll tax, one of the biggest and perhaps the most influential was the Great Victorian Crusade against alcohol. In the course of the 19th century, the Victorian Temperance Movement transformed the way ordinary people regarded drinking in Britain. It changed the law surrounding the buying and selling of drink, and challenged the central place that drinking occupied in British social life. But most importantly, temperance was a mass movement in which millions of people made a personal pledge to abstain and, they hoped, thereby improve their lives. To achieve their dream of a drink-free Britain, temperance campaigners created an alternative, alcohol-free world, a world of tea taverns, temperance outings and public meetings. Today, very little is left of the temperance world, but here and there the last remnants hang on.
While the demon of drink sways the scepter of shame.
I think I'll have one of those, dandelion and burdock cordial.
The bottle?
Alright. I'll have to give you that.
That's alright, thank you. £1.99. That's fine.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Ta-da now.
Ta-da now.
Ta-da.
One of the ways in which the temperance movement set about creating a drink-free world was by offering alternatives to the pub. I'm here in Rawtenstall in Lancashire, in Britain's last temperance bar. It's run by John Spencer. John, how old is this bar?
The bar has been here since 1890. The shop's called Fitzpatrick's, and old Mr. Fitzpatrick came over from Ireland in 1890 with his secret recipes, and he gradually opened temperance bars all over Lancashire, and this being one of them. And he put all various members of his family into each temperance bar, and this is the last one to keep going. All the others have died out.
These kegs behind the bar, do they contain the drinks?
Yes, they do. Yeah, I'll tell you what's in the kegs from left to right. In this large glass one, there's sarsaparilla. This one has blood tonic. This one has orange in and lemon. This one has cream soda, and this one has black beer and raisin. And then we have lemon punch and dandelion and burdock.
You have to tell me, what's in the blood tonic?
The blood tonic is it's actually called blood tonic because it's just a red coloured drink, but it's a raspberry flavour, and it's very refreshing in summer. Nice and refreshing.
And these wonderful drinks, are all the recipes original?
Yes, the drinks are still made to the same recipes as they were over 100 years ago.
Which one do you recommend?
Well, black beer and raisins are our most popular drink, and also sarsaparilla. People come from miles around to have a glass of black beer and raisin.
Well, I'd like to try one of those.
Yeah, do you want to try one? Nice frothy head.
Tastes like blackcurrant with a twist of something extra special and spicy.
Yeah, well, there's raisin in it, so that gives a good flavour.
So tell me, would I as a woman been able to have drunk this lovely drink in the 19th century?
Oh yes, yeah, that drink has been served in this shop for over 100 years.
And men and women would have come here?
Men and ladies, yeah. Yeah, it was to encourage the men to stop going in the pub and spending all their money on the drink, so they could come in here and they could play cards and dominoes and have a non-alcoholic drink and go home sober.
So really, this is just a alcohol-free pub?
That's right, that's what they call it around here, the pub with no beer. Or the little lad's pub.
The story of the Victorian battle against the demon drink began during the 18th century, when import duties were placed on spirits and a huge domestic industry flooded the nation with strong home-produced gin. By the middle of the century, the average man in London was drinking 14 gallons of spirits a year, on top of his normal 90 gallons of beer. One of the most famous critics of the gin boom of the 18th century was the artist William Hogarth. Sheila O'Connell is curator of the print room at the British Museum.
What we've got here are a pair of prints by Hogarth, Gin Lane and Beer Street. Gin Lane shows a scene of terrible devastation, in fact set quite near to the British Museum, with St George's Bloomsbury in the background, still recognisable today. But in the foreground, what catches the eye is a mother who's allowing her child to fall from her lap because she's already completely drunk. The child shows what Hogarth wouldn't have been able to identify at the time, but what he obviously observed, which is symptoms of fetal alcohol syndrome. The child has a pointed chin, very wide eyes, and sunken cheeks. Then we've got the pawnbroker, the most prosperous person to be seen, and a group of people who are pawning the tools of their trade. A carpenter's pawning his saw.
What inspired Hogarth to make this engraving?
Well, it was part of a campaign against gin drinking in the middle of the 18th century. There had been campaigns going on for about 20 years because gin and spirits generally were more readily available by that time. They were being imported from Holland to start off with, and then obviously made in London. The story goes that 1 in 6 houses in London sold gin.
So it was rather viewed like a modern-day plague, almost, sweeping through London, through the cities, destroying everybody it touched.
Yeah, absolutely, and also has lots of parallels with campaigns against drug taking today, and very much the same sort of rhetoric being used. But Gin Street was one of a pair of engravings. Let's look now at the other print, Beer Street, and it shows a very prosperous street, large fat butchers, people building new buildings. The only person who's poor is the pawnbroker, who's now has his house barricaded up because nobody needs to go to the pawnbroker, but a kindly soul is actually passing what looks like a half pint of beer as opposed to the larger flagons in through the door to him.
What's so interesting about these two prints is how even in the 18th century the evils of drink are recognised. But what the 18th century didn't recognise was the idea that beer or low-level drinking was a vice. It's seen as a necessity.
Absolutely. There was a great deal of anxiety about gin drinking, but not an anxiety about alcohol consumption per se.
The gin boom of the 18th century revealed the dangers of uncontrolled alcohol abuse. But it was in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century that all alcohol, even beer, became seen as a real social menace. By 1851, Britain had become the first country in the world where more people lived in towns than in the country. Millions found themselves living in towns and cities with little sanitation and appalling conditions. Old communities were broken up, and drink became an escape from a very hard existence. The result was a huge increase in alcohol consumption and drunkenness, with dreadful human costs. Professor Norman MacCord of Newcastle University.
In our world, most families have an income which can sustain a modest amount of drinking without imperiling the financial position of the family as a whole. But for much of the 19th century, most working families had an income which was so low that it was almost all taken up in essential matters like food, rent, clothing, and there was very little leeway for any kind of recreational expenditure or additional expenditure. And this meant that even quite modest increases of expenditure on drink might make all the difference in the world between a family being financially viable and a family spending beyond its means, with the social disaster that that might entail.
Dear Father, come home with me now. The clock in the steeple strikes 1. You said you were coming right home from the shop as soon as your day's work was done. Our fire has gone out, the house is all dark, and Mother's been watching since tea. With poor brother Benny so sick in her arms, and no one to help her but me.
There's no doubt that in the early decades of the 19th century, drink destroyed millions of lives and wrecked thousands of families. But the fact that this was recognized was only part of the reason for the emergence of the temperance movement. Temperance was also fueled by the great evangelical revival, in which religious concerns seeped out of the churches and into every corner of Victorian life. A temperance campaign against spirits had emerged in Scotland in the early 19th century, but it was amongst the religiously active communities of the new industrial towns of northern England in the 1830s that the temperance crusade really began. Preston in Lancashire was described as the Jerusalem of teetotalism by Joseph Livesey, an orphaned Lancashire handloom weaver who gave up alcohol after a teenage drinking binge. Livesey became the great father of teetotalism and transformed the temperance movement from an anti-spirits campaign to a mass anti-drink crusade. Although his great personal obsession was the reclaiming of drunks, his greatest contribution to temperance was the single most brilliant new technique of the movement, the teetotal pledge, a personal statement to denounce alcohol and live a drink-free life. Preston, where Livesey based his campaign, is now home to the biggest collection of temperance artefacts, the archives and library of the British National Temperance League, now fittingly called the Livesey Collection. Aidan Turner Bishop is the keeper of the archives.
This is the first teetotal pledge, September 1832, and it says, "We agree to abstain from all liquors of an intoxicating quality, whether ale, porter, wine, or ardent spirits, except as medicine."
Why did the pledge include medicinal purposes?
Well, I think that was so they could still continue to use brandy, because you'd need that a lot in Victorian medicine. Remember, this is the age before anaesthetics. Strict teetotalers came along maybe 10 years. So around about 1840s, you have absolute strict, no alcohol at all teetotalers.
Where did these pledges take place?
Sometimes they took place in public meetings, like Billy Graham revival meetings, but very often through the medium of the pledge books. You would actually sign these little books here. This one is a gospel temperance pledge. This must be 1870s, 1880s, very elaborately printed. There's gospel there with sun rays out of it, and you sign the pledge, and the receipt is torn off, which you keep, but cannily the Gospel Temperance League keeps a copy of your name and address. There is a constant reminder there that you have taken the pledge. And this long, thin one here, red one, like a great big checkbook, Army Temperance Pledge. And this has your name, rank, troop, battery, and of course there are other ones for the Navy and the railways, and all the other big institutions of Victorian England have their own pledge books. Where they are now, I don't know, but this is a nice example. Pledge, I promise by God's help to abstain from all intoxicating liquors as beverages, and endeavour by precept and example to commend this practice to others. And that would be signed by squaddies and officers in the army.
One of the well-known features about the 19th century is that it is a period of the development of the pressure group. Pressure groups of all kinds arose in the course of the 19th century on a scale that had never known before. One of the pioneers, or one of the exemplars of this, was the early Victorian Anti-Corn Law League, where an organization which was in reality not terribly strong managed to project by skillful propaganda an image of strength and influence far beyond its real resources. And then, of course, the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846, so anyone who had a cause at heart tended to turn to this model and imitate it. And as the 19th century wore on, the temperance movement very much became a sophisticated, varied, clever propaganda movement, exploiting all the resources which that society could provide. Tracts, newspapers, magic lantern lectures. This is a period in which literacy is extending considerably. The volume of publications in the way of newspapers and all other kinds of publications, including temperance tracts, is growing astronomically. And the publicity given to excessive drinking was something that was always on the increase, so that it's more easy for public awareness to grow. And of course, this is a period in which the gathering and publication of statistics is becoming increasingly wide and sophisticated as time goes by. So you could, by the end of the 19th century, for example, have a book which displays drunkenness in England and Wales, showing the different levels of drunkenness recorded in each county. And in a whole variety of ways, the question of drink and temperance was thrust into the forefront of public attention as the 19th century goes on.
Won't you sign the pledge, dear friends, today? Won't you firmly take a stand? Make the resolution now, we pray. Won't you join the temperance band? Sign the pledge and make your conscience clear. Joy and peace will be yours throughout the year.
But the Great Crusade was much more than a political movement. Temperance campaigners were utterly convinced of the righteousness of their cause. They saw alcohol as the demon drink. They aimed at a temperance reformation, a new awakening that would create a new society. And they were inventive in their methods, not only of converting the drunkards, but also of maintaining the good habits of the converted. Aidan Turner Bishop.
Now this is the box with lots of treasures from the Livesey collection. Just open it up. I've got to be very careful with this. They were very good at propaganda, the early temperance pioneers. And this is some temperance ware. And here's a nice piece. This is a lovely cup and saucer. And inside this, do you see what it says? It says, "Put no rum in me." And then a beautiful crest of the Preston Temperance Society, sobriety, firm as an oak, domestic comfort. And see the man and the woman there, the respectable couple. Be thou faithful unto death. And this thing here now, it's an old Victorian wooden rattle, all polished. Do you want to have a rattle with it?
Well, I'd love to. What did Livesey do with it?
He used to go through the streets of Preston and call his giant monster meetings, and as he went through the streets would whirl the rattle. This worked in the 1830s, and it's still in perfect condition now in the 1990s.
Well, let's hope I don't break it.
You'd soon hear that if you were going through the streets. They were very good at that sort of publicity. Badges, lantern slide meetings, monster rallies, processions, brass bands, all those sort of events, because this is the age before television. Drink ran through the Industrial Revolution, through the cotton industry. There were beer houses and pubs on every street corner and halfway down the streets. It dominated the lives of working class people there, and it had a very serious social effect. It worried people the way drugs worry people nowadays, and they were trying to put a stop to that, to control it, and to lead people away from alcohol.
Why specifically do they resort to these methods?
I suppose it's to keep a presence in the house, a constant reminder that you had taken this pledge, you had gone public and stood up in front of a large group of people and said you would renounce alcohol. And the cup on the sideboard, the cup on the table was there to remind you all the time. A lot of this movement was about personal self-improvement. It tied in with self-education, with learning to read, with a bit like California nowadays, the whole personal improvement movement. Because remember, these people were powerless politically. They didn't have the vote. You couldn't go out and change your MP or lobby Parliament, because Parliament, frankly, wasn't interested. You just had to change yourself. And you felt it had an immediate result, too.
As well as being one of the first mass movements in our history, temperance was also one of the first campaigns to involve both men and women. The Victorian notion of the essential frailty of women led to the widespread belief that they were especially susceptible to being ruined by alcohol. Gin famously became known as mother's ruin, so women were encouraged not only to avoid the dangers of drink, but also to play an increasingly central role in the temperance crusade itself. Dr. Margaret Barrow.
The role of women in the temperance movement varied with time. Initially, they were expected to almost be the guardians of the temperance family. It was their role to educate their husbands and their children, more importantly their children, to the temperance way of life. And they realised that this was an opportunity for them to do more and become more politically involved in the temperance movement. So they expanded it out and tried to make their role more political, and they sought avidly legislation on drink, and they campaigned over a wide range of issues, particularly those that affected women. For many years they sought to abolish the grocers' licenses. This they saw as a way in which drink could come into the home through the back door, in that women could order it with their groceries and it would not be noticed on the bill, and it would put women at risk. And by this way it would lead them on the downward path to destitution and, importantly for the Victorian times, the breakup of the family.
This is the old Temperance Billiards Hall near the Thames in South London. Pevsner, the great architectural historian, described this place as having enough presence to confront the King's Arms pub, which is actually still opposite. Well, today, the Victorian pro-drink lobby will be very happy to see that instead of being a wholesome alternative to the King's Arms, the billiards hall is ironically now itself a pub. But places like this were set up across Britain by temperance societies in order to try and create an alternative drink-free world that would make it easier for those who had taken the pledge to live a temperate life in alcohol-sodden Britain. Dr. Margaret Barrow.
The temperance movement managed to make a temperance way of life. You could find temperance everywhere around you if you wanted. You would have a membership of an association or a society or even a fraternal society. Many members were members of several organisations. There were many benefits, particularly for the working class, over joining a temperance society. They could probably get cheap insurance because it was perceived that non-drinkers would actually live longer than drinkers, and so they negotiated things. There would be burial clubs as well. The working classes would subscribe to them, so they could be insured of a good burial. There would be savings banks, day trips, there would be entertainments. It was a complete way of life with teetotal hotels, tea taverns, children's society. The whole family would be involved in this. It would be a temperance family.
Throughout the 19th century, temperance was the target of savage ridicule. But although the movement grossly exaggerated the scale of alcoholism and the role of drink in the problems of Victorian society, it undoubtedly saved thousands of people from destitution and premature death. For a handful of others, it offered not only the encouragement, but the markets to practice their entrepreneurial skills. Cassell, the publishing house, was founded by John Cassell, a Manchester carpenter and printer of the Teetotal Times. But the most famous company to come out of the temperance movement was founded in Leicester in 1841. In later life, Thomas Cook recalled how his great invention, the Charter Holiday, was inspired by his devotion to the cause of temperance.
The whole thing seemed to come to me by intuition. I was an enthusiastic temperance man and the secretary of a district association which embraced parts of the two counties of Leicester and Northampton. A great meeting was to be held at Leicester. From my residence at Market Harborough, I walked there 15 miles to attend. About midway between Harborough and Leicester, my mind's eye has often reverted to the spot, a thought flashed through my brain. What a glorious thing it would be if the newly developed powers of railways and locomotion could be made subservient to the promotion of temperance. That thought grew upon me as I travelled over the last 6 or 8 miles. I carried it up to the platform, and strong in the confidence of the sympathy of the chairman, I broached the idea of engaging a special train to carry the Friends of Temperance from Leicester to Loughborough and back, to attend a quarterly delegate meeting appointed to be held there in 2 or 3 weeks following. The chairman approved. The meeting roared with excitement. We carried music with us, and music met us at the Loughborough station. The people crowded the streets, filled windows, covered the housetops, and cheered us all along the line with the heartiest welcome. All went off in the best style, and in perfect safety we returned to Leicester.
Thomas Cook organised temperance excursions to Derby each year on the day of the Leicester races, to take people out of the way of temptation, as he himself described it. He'd probably be horrified to know that today his company owns the infamous Club 1830 holidays, hardly known for their sobriety. At its height, the movement estimated that there were some 3 million temperate households in Britain, but for millions of drinkers, temperance was always seen as an eccentricity, and their rallies and their marches just a nuisance. Yet there is no doubt that temperance saved lives, and did some good. It helped modify and control the British obsession with drinking. Professor McCord.
In the early 19th century, and even more so perhaps the late 18th century, drinking to excess is found quite commonly in that society. And the whole story of the changing attitudes towards drink in the course of the 19th century is part of the much wider story of how the brutal, vicious, violent society, which is true of much of 18th century Britain, becomes, by the end of the 19th century, imbued with qualities which we would normally think of as Victorian, as respectable. At the end of the century, British society was very far from perfect, very far from completely free from vice and crime and violence, but it was a great deal more civilized than it had been when the century began. One of the aspects of this was that whereas in the late 18th century, drinking to excess by many of those who could afford to do it was looked upon as a quite natural form of behavior to be expected, by the end of the 19th century, someone who was a drunkard, at whatever level in society, would find that that meant a bad reputation. It wasn't acceptable behavior. It was regarded as something inherently wrong, to a degree which would not have been the case at the end of the previous century.
In the last decades of the Victorian age, the great temperance crusade was transformed by a campaign in favour of prohibition. This divided the movement, and the rejection of prohibition in the election of 1895 was the first step in the long decline of temperance. Today, very little remains of the once mighty temperance world. There is still the odd temperance hall, and most towns have a couple of temperance water fountains that we pass by without noticing. A few of the original societies still exist, campaigning almost unnoticed, these days as much against drugs as drink. But perhaps the real legacy and the real importance of temperance was that it was one of the first and greatest self-help movements in British history. It created a tradition of campaigning and political involvement amongst groups long excluded from power, women and the poor. Women applied many of the methods learnt in the service of temperance in the fight for the vote, and many of the first leaders of the emerging labour movement were ex-temperance campaigners.
The wife needs protection, the orphan a home, while the demon of drink sways the sceptre of shame.
The Demon Drink was presented by Amanda Foreman and produced in Bristol by David Olashoga. The pianist was David Owen Norris and the vocalist was Robert Evans. The reader was Andrew Hilton.